Here's what you missed this week on The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We're coming to you from these United States of America, here in the middle of the country, good old Iowa, making sure to represent the corn state, the pork state, just a good state, bud. And we're here on Iowa Catholic Radio, and we are all happy you can be here with us. I'm Bo Bonner. I am the host of the Catholic Morning Show, among other things. Bud, what are you doing in the old ball town?
I am, let me see, Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Mercy College of Health Sciences downtown, so helping train the future healthcare professionals of America, and hopefully a lot of them in this state.
Absolutely. We're happy to have you with us. We want to thank Imogene Ingredients, who makes this show possible. Tip of the hat to old Imogene. Imogene Ingredients, thank you for underwriting the show. It's wonderful to have great people like the folks over there at Imogene Ingredients, making sure that this show keeps trucking along.
Bo, I know our time is short during this first segment, but I'm a little bit grumpy this week.
Uh-oh.
You know, we were kind of spoiled, like a very wet summer, a lot of rain, and then a cool, like, end to August, but I feel like
Summer Part 2.
This summer part 2, this mid-September heat wave has been... Because it doesn't feel right to drink pumpkin spice when it's 85 degrees
That's true.
outside.
Yeah, you know, people started talking about false fall, that there's like, you get a false fall and then like one more heat wave. And I really do feel that false fall was extremely real this year. Really real false fall. So, but man, I hope it changes because I too am ready for it to be fall in a big way. But coming up on the show for the rest of the segments, we're going to be talking about Leo the 14th's first 100 days and 30-ish. We kind of went past his 100 days, but we got another month in there, and I think it's going to be stuff. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr, joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. We want to say thank you to Imogene Ingredients for making the show possible. Thank you for underwriting The Uncommon Good. Bud, we've kind of zoomed past this, but we wanted to, in August, Pope Leo the 14th had his first 100 days. So if, by my math, that's like 130 days he's up to, close to now. The point being is, we've got a good chunk of Pope Leo being the vicar of Christ on earth, and we thought, maybe this would be a good, something to dwell on, reflect upon, some of the things he said, some of the things that he's brought up, and reflect in a sort of uncommon good sort of way, maybe about how this goes into Catholic social teaching, social justice, the ideas that permeate all the things that we've talked about on the uncommon good. But I think that what sold us on this idea is one of the central things that Leo the 14th brings up in every way, every time nearly, whenever he gets a chance, is he's really put peace at the foreground of everything that his papacy is about. Now, it's not that Pope Francis or any modern pope has not liked peace. There's been no pro-war pope in our lifetime.
Right.
But what I want to say is that it makes sense that Leo the 14th, the Augustinian, who's an Augustinian friar and for whom St. Augustine is so central, it is very much that he brings up talking about peace as far as nation against nation or on earth or in a political way, but it's because for him there's a profound, deep ontological and theological reality about peace that it has come to shape his papacy and the newness of his papacy so far in a way that is elemental, even though literally all three of the last popes that we've had have argued on the world stage about the importance of peace and sued for peace and have tried to be active for peace. But I got to say that there's something that just undergirds everything about what Pope Leo XIV does when it comes to the concept of peace.
Right. And I know shortly after his election, or immediately afterwards, really, you and I did a show on who was the new pope, who was this Robert Prevost who had been chosen by the cardinals. And at the time, there was a lot of questioning about that because, he had been thrown around as a possible name during the conclave, but wasn't, so to speak, like a front runner. And Bo, what I've been kind of struck by during the first 130 days or so is kind of what I would call like the form of the papacy. I feel like even today, where maybe people read books less than maybe a generation ago, we still we have our phones, we're attached to the news, and it's a lot of words, right? Like we're digesting a lot of information. And when it comes to recent papacies, we've done that as well. We've kind of parsed interviews and read homilies and papal addresses. And by the form of this papacy, what struck me is Pope Leo, to me, has a kind of manifest patience so far.
Yep.
And it's funny to say that after we're not even it's been a third of a year. But okay, one thing that we should say at the start of the show, we want to avoid any sort of stark our goal here is not to say
top 5 popes,
this pope versus that pope, et cetera, et cetera. But I mean, folks have pointed out that often Pope Francis didn't necessarily take a vacation. He kind of continued his normal papal responsibilities throughout the summer. Leo was obviously intentional this summer to step away. Is it Castel Gandolfo?
Yes.
Where Pope's vacation. But he seems careful with his words, maybe a little less out in the public, and sort of a kind of reserved constitution where shortly after he was elected, those who knew him closely said they were always struck by how good of a listener he is.
Mm-hmm.
And I think during this first 130 days or so, there's been this patience and this listening. He's talked, it sounds to folks from different places in the church and political life. And I think he's really trying to get a sense of the lay of the land.
Well, I think one thing that we just have to admit is all popes, especially in the modern era, have had to deal in their own way that, as you say, how you present yourself to the media, and of course we've talked a lot about media ecology on this show, that's part and parcel of being a modern pope. And I don't just mean the recent ones. This goes all the way back to, Leo XIII, right, himself was the first one to be ever filmed. He was on radio. And of course, as all of this technology progressed, this becomes more and more of an issue. But I do think it's fair, Bud, to say John Paul II is sort of a sea change in most people could probably look at a picture and know who the Pope is, even if they're not Catholic, even if they're not very involved, right? Because that was just the sort of media age that we lived in. John Paul II, of course, didn't really hit the internet. His death, I think, maybe was on the interwebs. But I don't think there was social media, for instance. Or if it was very nascent.
Right.
Okay. But what I will say is his television presence was so well known that I think he sort of gets shoehorned into this a bit. And people, because John Paul II did media as he did, all popes going forward were going to have to say, what sort of image do I cultivate? And look, already that probably makes some people out there uncomfortable because that's so the popes have to market themselves. Well, they have to choose whether that's what it's going to look like. But I think, like you were saying, it's fair to say, even though many of the popes share a lot of the same concerns, and we can't overdo it with just saying, based off of a few appearances, it is very much the case that I think each pope has been intentional about the way they are presented on media. And I think that goes to show that they are indeed holy fathers that think about what's good for their flock. So John Paul II exuded energy, right?
Yeah.
And in some ways, he even exuded energy and activity as he got old and was dying, right? In some ways, what John Paul II sort of showed the end of his life on display, and even being old and Parkinson's, right? And all the things, that sort of kinetic pope. Benedict XVI, of course, people maybe sort of overdo it. They say he's reserved, but of course he had a big world travel schedule as well. But the idea of a certain gentleness, right, that Benedict XVI had, especially surprised people who wanted him to be the Panzer Cardinal and all of these things like this. Pope Francis probably sort of got back to the sort of kinetic pope, probably not as sort of dashing and as athletic as John Paul II, but certainly, like you said, activity, wanting to be there, wanting to be at places, to be amidst people. And so this gets us to Leo XIV, and like you said, patience, but again, peace, but not simply just, peace means so many things, but I think he has a peaceful presence. Yeah. I think people feel like they can not chill out, but feel like things are going to be okay when Pope Leo shows up. That's my first impression of, just like you said, the demeanor and the form he takes in his media appearances.
Yeah, I think so. John Paul II in early adulthood was an actor, right? Or
Correct.
He was interested in theater.
Yes.
And he seemed to, just by being a part of that world, that when he was Pope, he was very aware of how he was perceived. So if he was giving a public audience, I think of his visits to the United States. He, of course, famously visited Iowa. I say famously like it's a big, thing that we sort of hang our hats on. And when he was in those crowds or among those crowds, he really fed off that energy-wise.
Yes.
But also had a sense of like, I mean, I'm saying this in a positive way. Sometimes we say play the crowds, and it's someone who can be kind of like manipulative or something. But he was just a good public speaker, and he could almost do this like call and response thing with young people. Benedict XVI, the successor to John Paul II, like he was much more reserved and bookish. And, he did have that kind of like travel itinerary that you were talking about. But I always had the sense that like he would rather be in a library. And I think in his memoirs, he even talked about this, like he kind of regretted that his scholarly activities were curtailed by being tabbed by John Paul II to head the CDF, et cetera, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And then finally, like with Pope Francis, you're right. He had this kind of like active spirit that in some ways was like John Paul II, but Francis talked a lot about mercy. And I think for him, it was important to have these like public displays of mercy, not like in a prideful manner, but like he wanted to show to the world sort of like what it looked like, the things that he was talking about. It's funny because to me, like Benedict XVI in the circles that I run in is known as like kind of the liturgical pope. But I don't think I can recall as many instances with him as I have with Leo where there's like this really obvious devotion when he's praying and celebrating Mass, like moved to tears or sort of like caught up in the moment where it's clear. I mean, I think it's clear to me so far that he has a strong devotion to the Blessed Sacrament.
Yes.
And is like moved emotionally in this recognition that God is present sacramentally on the altar.
And that's what I mean is that he tries to he brought up peace and unity very early on, right? So his first greeting after being elected, it is the peace of the risen Christ, a peace that is unarmed and disarming, humble and persevering, a peace that comes from God, the God who loves us all unconditionally. And then at the Vigil of Pentecost, in a divided and troubled world, the Holy Spirit teaches us to walk together in unity. And for me, he tries to embody that in his public appearances. And it seems like, all of the popes have realized that part of their job is to be the public face of Catholicism, whether they like it or not. Mm-hmm. And, I think when you talk about John Paul II, like you said, fed off the crowds, he had acting. And, I think back to, we had Artur Rossmann on talking about, like, the philosophy of drama from Paul Tishner, another Polish person. And I think that, like, really embodied what he was like. I think Benedict XVI was most comfortable in the Wednesday audiences when he got to teach. And, people hear like, a thinker and a scholar. But just as Thomas Aquinas has wonderful, very approachable sermons, I think Benedict XVI was his best as a sermon pope. Pope Francis, like you said, wanted to be among people and sort of demonstrate to people that the church can be among the people. But I just got to say, Pope Leo's holding babies and kissing them. He's laughing when people bring him, the Chicago pizza. But he's also doing all of these liturgical things. And when he speaks even, it's less like the scholar pope, the actor pope, showing this to us. It's less the scholar pope informing us. It's less the pope of the people being among people. It is this, even in talking about theological truths, he is so peaceful when he does that. And I know people might think I'm like overdoing it, but I think he means to do it because of St. Augustine and St. Augustine's idea of we cannot rest until we rest in you, and that we speaking to God, and that we don't have unity until we unify our desires in a community towards God. I think he really means to do this. I don't think it's simply an accident of his style or character.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's important for pastors and a pope to model. As Catholics, we practice the corporal works of mercy. And our Lord, of course, he he spurred us on to care for those who are without clothing, drink, food, those who are in prison, etc. But there is a kind of activism that I think is a movement further away from God, where it's this kind of understanding where it's like our job to solve the world's problems, where, I mean, this is something that I think the Jesuits do pretty well, where they talk about contemplative action.
Yeah.
It's like action that's always rooted in prayer, and it's fueled by your relationship with God, and this kind of like the sacraments, they give you life, and then that life flows out from the body of Christ to others. But I think, like you're saying, like Pope Leo sort of models this kind of like patient waiting on God to lead, and we're called to witness to what God has done in our lives. And that expresses itself through charitable acts, etc. But there's a prioritization of things. Kind of related to all that, I mean, going in a little bit different direction, like my prayers are really with this Pope in a particular way. And the analogy that I think about, Bo, is so like each Pope faces like particular challenges, or like there's the context, the social context within which like he comes to the papal throne. And with Leo, I think it's no longer the Big Ten West.
Right.
Like so I mean,
Sorry,
you've got like the conflict in Gaza, you still have like the Ukraine-Russia war going on. Of course, like violence and strife in our own nation in different ways, or like political polarization. And I think because of his historical situatedness, that people are kind of looking for a pope who will act quickly. And what I mean by that is like, in part, I think because he's American, like
right.
he can trace his roots back to the United States. American Catholics are already kind of prone to like sort of, I think, wanting a pope who's, so to speak, on our team. But it's like, I don't know, even myself, I find myself sort of like having this kind of desire. So like, why doesn't the Pope speak to this concern or that concern, forgetting that he's pastor of like a global church? But I mean, there's some serious things going on in the world, and I'm sure the Holy Father like struggles with, what do I speak to? How do I speak to these things in such a way that I'm mindful of members of the body of Christ who are sort of like sometimes on different lines of divisions that the world has sort of created.
Yes, and I think that we talk about peace, we talk about unity, but he talks about love. And look, again, John Paul II wrote entire things about marital love. One of Benedict XVI's greatest encyclicals is his one on love, Deus Caritas. As Pope Francis talks about love and mercy multiple times. But again, it strikes me about this sort of Augustinian take on loves, and how it is that the love of the city of God and the love of the city of man come into conflict, but that it's that fundamental love of God for us that he's demonstrated in Jesus Christ that shows us that we can prevail, even as you said, like the ways that he has this sort of finger on the world's divisions, not only because he's from the U.S., but that he was also in Peru. But then, of course, as the head of the new bishops guy, I'm forgetting what it's called, but that's what he was before Pope.
Oh,
yeah. So the what is that? The dicastery of bishops, I think.
Yeah,
right?
I think that's right. Sorry,
I came up with a fake Vatican name. So, for instance, he has a catechesis on betrayal quote, and by the way, thank you Catholic News Agency that pulled 50 quotes from his first 100 days. Jesus is not scandalized by our fragility. He knows well that no friendship is immune from the risk of betrayal, but Jesus continues to trust. He continues to sit at the table with his followers. He does not give up breaking bread, even for those who will betray him. This is the silent power of God. He never abandons the table of love, even when he knows he will be left alone. And so, added to that sort of, you said, a patience that you felt, a calming influence, but again, I just feel that his realism about how difficult this will be, but this sure faith that love will see through even all of the divisions. So, his calls for peace seem less desperate to me than maybe, not other popes, but just other people talking about it. He calls for peace knowing that it will come to pass, and that there is something, always a thread of love, that God himself, that Jesus will never abandon the table of love, even in the midst of this strife that we are so dead set on creating.
Yeah, and I know others have commented on the very Christocentric nature of his homilies and his addresses. I didn't take the time before the show to kind of like run statistics on this.
Right.
But I think he always he does in a profound way come back to Christ. And when you use that phrase like a call for peace that sounds less desperate, I think in some ways it's related to the fact that he knows like where the answer is found. So like on Corpus Christi, Christ is God's answer to our human hunger. I think he's challenged us in different homilies and addresses to say like we look for peace and happiness in so many other different places, but that vain search for happiness like outside of Christ, it actually exacerbates the problems that plague our life. And so there is this kind of like frenetic pace to human life. And of course, as Pope, like recent popes, he's concerned about like things like our care for the natural world, a just economy. You know, I mean, I kind of liked when he was talking about like the possibility of someone in the near future becoming a trillionaire.
Yeah.
He said that'd be a failure for humanity. Like we kind of frame that as sort of like, oh, look at this, what this guy has accomplished or whatever. But thinking about like the implications on down the line. But there's not, I think for Pope Leo, there's not sort of like a wheel we can turn or a knob with like if we turn the right screws, like we can sort of like fix all these things. It's coming back to Christ, specifically our Lord in the Eucharist. And like you said, kind of like resting in that and then being in the world in a fundamentally different way than sort of like what's projected onto us by Wall Street and the commercials that we see, you know, day after day, hour after hour.
Absolutely. And another thing I would say is this is where he can end up sounding very traditional in the vein of Leo XIII, whom he took his name after. And obviously we can get into Rerum Novarum and the ways he's already pointed that in the second segment. But to close this one out, when he talks about the family, I feel that this is where in some ways he's the closest to sounding like Leo XIII. People forget how much Leo XIII talked about families in the modern world of his time, and it seems to me Leo XIV is following suit. So, for instance, he was talking about to diplomatic corps at this point, Bud. So not just like World Family Day, diplomats. And he goes, it is the responsibility of government leaders to work to build harmonious and peaceful civil societies. You're like, okay, Uncommon Good wants to hear about this, but also, right, that's something he's saying to diplomats. He continues, this can be achieved above all by investing in the family, founded upon the stable union between a man and a woman. And this gets into why Leo XIII, for instance, cared so much in Rerum Novarum about labor. Because he said, how are people going to take care of their families in this new economic order if everything is based off of the principle of utility and just running people into the ground? Leo XIV, when he, to my estimation, sounds the most like Leo XIII so far, is when he says things about families. One of the most powerful, wonderful expressions of the love of God is the love that is poured out by mothers, especially to their children and grandchildren. We're speaking to the Jubilee of families. And you, dear children, show gratitude to your parents, saying thank you each day for the gift of life and for all that comes with it. This is the first way to honor your father and your mother. So in this very practical thing, right, like, of course, we all expect popes to care about families. But I think about that, speaking about it to the diplomatic corps and saying, if you want peaceful and stable societies, there's that peace again, there's unity again. You have to care about families, the stable union between a man and a woman. And in that, right, is not only very traditional, but I think evokes his namesake, who once again, prescient on what he saw as the coming difficulties that people were going to face with that new economic order at the turn of the Industrial Revolution. But why is he so concerned? Because of how it is making it difficult to have stable families between a woman and a man. Leo XIV now saying this is occurring again. Diplomats should care about this. Governments should care about this. And all of us should care about this, particularly, Bud, which I think we'll get into in the second segment, when it comes to technology and the new technology's application and effect on the economy in particular. This is Bo Bonner and Bud Marr, the Uncommon Good. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with the Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr, joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. We once again want to thank Imogene Ingredients for underwriting the show and making it all possible. We are talking about Pope Leo's first 100 days and some change, probably around 30-ish more. I'm not good at math, Bud, but you get the idea. We passed that milestone, and although that doesn't mean we have the new Pope all figured out, I think it's fair to say that we got quite a good look into, if not his priorities, but I think so in some of those, part of his demeanor, the form he's hoping his papacy takes, at least in its presentation to the public. There's just things that he's obviously revealing. One of them we've obviously already hit upon in former shows, Bud, because we've talked about religion and technology quite a bit, is his concern about artificial intelligence in general. But I think particularly to sort of blend in from the last segment, he's really worried about what he calls a new rerum novarum. And if that's not a direct quote, I'm paraphrasing. I'm going to have to go find it. But again, this idea of if he cares about things like families, if he cares about stability, unity, and peace, like his namesake Leo XIII, he says, how are we going to have stable families? How are we going to have unity in societies? How are we going to have peace? Well, we have to look to the new technologies, particularly the media and communication ones, and ask, what is their role going to be on society? AI, obviously, with work itself, but again, in a very Augustinian fashion, he's actually really worried about the violence of rhetoric. He's actually compared rhetoric and war multiple times, which is something St. Augustine has done. St. Augustine always ready to say that rhetoric that doesn't care about truth is like a sword trying to pierce people, things like this. And I think that that's something that we don't even need to go into detail, Bud, to point out how the rhetoric of online digital communication already undermines stability, unity, and certainly peace. And I think that's why it's one of his central concerns. So it's not just he goes like, oh, well, what's the big thing everyone's talking about on Google, AI? I'm going to bring that up in my papacy. No, I actually think it's because he's very Augustinian and very much Leo XIII protege, that he says these technologies are exactly counter to these principles that we've already talked about quite a bit.
Yeah, but when he was elected and then over the course of the summer, I was thinking to myself, it's kind of a bummer, like you, and I guess you could have included me on the project, like we didn't have like some just oil baron Catholic who lived in Des Moines who could fund like the Pope Leo XIV Institute for the responsible use of digital technologies.
Out of the gate.
I know. So Pope Leo has addressed this topic like in a talk, but are you still sort of waiting for the possibility of an encyclical?
Yes, although, again, this is more rumor central than anything, but, this is like people seemingly talking with officials in Rome.
Yeah.
I think they're saying his first encyclical is likely to be about the poor and our obligation to the poor. That is, again, not confirmed, but I think people were like, oh, this might be the first thing he talks about out of the gate is technology, but it actually seems like he might be talking about the poor. Again, that's very vague, and it's like sort of like the Italian media reporting. But I do very much see, because of how much he talks about it, I'm guessing there's going to be something. But I'm not Nostradamus here, so I'm not gonna make a prediction about when and where.
Well, when you talk about an encyclical on the poor, and then tracking backwards to what we were saying about digital technologies and artificial intelligence, don't you think that one of the real challenges that moral theologians and, of course, like Pope as the universal pastor of the church face is just the scale of these questions? And what I mean by that is, so you think about the advent of the internet, and now with artificial intelligence, how quickly we can generate like new content. Mm-hmm. And then, I mean, this is an imprecise analogy, but then thinking about economics, and you go back like even a millennia, and most of what like craftsmen and tradesmen produced was to scale. It was things that like we sort of like made with our hands. And, like there was already like, of course, like monetary economies like in the Middle Ages and things like this, but there was a real close connection between like what you crafted and then how you provided for your family, like the food on your table. And now you've got sort of like, I think one of the ethical issues when it comes to digital technologies and responsible use of something like the internet or artificial intelligence is just like, even for someone like myself, it's like, where is wisdom to be found? Because what's coming at me, like, there's so much. And if I sit down at my desk at work and like jump on my laptop, like the possibilities of what I can sort of like research or pursue are almost like limitless. And then again, like, like when it comes to like capital and things, like just like this, like the possibility of a trillionaire, it is almost sort of like mind boggling. Like, of course, like one individual really couldn't spend that amount of money over their lifetime. And so it's almost hard to like sort of like fathom or wrap your mind around what that means or looks like.
No, and I mean, there's this is another quote. Again, thank you, CNA, Catholic News Agency, for providing 50 quotes from his first 100 days, giving us some fodder to talk about. But I think it gets at what you're saying, that like the internet, AI, all of this stuff playing that aspect, that role in it. But he sort of widens the lens. I think this includes it. So the Pope says, a very widespread ailment of our time is the fatigue of living, which again, I've had multiple students read, like I've taught Augustine's Confessions multiple times. I had the chance to teach it with my daughter. And so one of the things I always loved that she said is that Augustine can sometimes sound like a teenager in an emo band. Like he can really get up in his feels. And I do think this is true. I think that's why certain Christian existentialists sort of like point to St. Augustine and his Confessions. But that fatigue of living, Bud, is something that I think we all have to admit that we're again and again facing a brutal reality about. The sort of nihilism that comes into the sort of violence that's cascading across America, that is on the lips of many of us, right? Reality seems to be too complex, burdensome, difficult to face, continues the Pope. And so we switch off, we fall asleep in the delusion that upon waking, things will be different. But reality has to be faced, and together with Jesus, we can do it well. Very much a Leo XIV quote to say, to be honest about like the darkness and the difficulty, but to say we can wake up and do it well. And again, to sort of talk about Augustine very much a Plato guy, and Plato, what's his big motif for when like we fall out of the philosophical life is a being asleep, right? Or being mad, or like being drowsy. That's like continuously Plato and Socrates talk about this. And so Augustine has this too, that we can fall asleep to the reality of God, and that's what allows us to like become, a lull that has us like be bogged down in desires and things like this. And so when Pope Leo's saying we can wake up and face the reality together, I think that that's very powerful. Not like a complete answer to what you were bringing up, but I think that's the direction he's trying to go in this papacy.
Yeah, you've hearkened to St. Augustine a few times on the show, and with Pope Leo XIV, there have been a number of commentators who say like he's a new Leo, and how he chose that name thinking about Leo XIII and what Leo XIII faced, and how this new Pope Leo would address kind of the concerns of our time. But I like this idea of like this Augustinian thread. I was trying to find the quote as you were talking. Is it Mark Twain who said like history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes?
Yeah. If not, I mean, it sounds like something Mark Twain said, or Julius Caesar.
Right.
One of those quotes. Abe Lincoln.
Like, it's interesting how even church history has these like resonances, or it's kind of like this symphony where there will be a motif that kind of returns to itself. So when you were pointing to that quote where he says like reality today sometimes almost feels too burdensome to face. Mm-hmm. Another thing that he's addressed is this theme of hope. And he says, as human beings, we're looking for a lasting hope.
Yes.
Like, it seems like sometimes the world is crumbling around us, or even like the things that we love and hold dearly, that they sort of slip through our fingers. And so our desire is to kind of like have what we love, but that thing will persist beyond like the vagaries of time. And I think in that way, like you mentioned the Confessions, when Pope Leo talks in that manner, it almost reminds me of the city of God. Mm-hmm. And St. Augustine, in his day and age, like the empire was falling apart, or was like it was entering a new stage. And at that time, there were so many people around Augustine who were like, it was like harrowing for them. Like, it was difficult to face because the thing that had provided sort of like stability and order was going away. And in our time, like, we don't know what the next bit, like what's behind the next bend in history. But I do think today there are a lot of like both commentators, but also sort of like lay people or just like people in society more generally who feel like something new and different is on the horizon. Like this kind of order, like the Pax Americana that's characterized like the last 2 centuries, that like that's going away in some sense. We don't know what the next will look like, but there's a temptation to either hang on to what we've received, like to cling to that, or to try to like accelerate a sort of revolution. But like Leo has reminded us in homilies and in other places, like where is our hope truly found, and what can provide lasting peace, not a sort of like a drug that has like a temporary like satiation.
You have brought up, now I'm going to be like this guy and just like say multiple things he said to completely back up what you're saying. So when he was first elected, he's like, I'm an Augustinian, a son of Augustine, who once said, with you I am a Christian and for you I am a bishop. And in that sense, all of us can journey together to the homeland that God has prepared for us. Getting exactly what you say. Getting more at that, the fullness of our existence does not depend on what we store up, or as we heard in the gospel, what we possess. Rather, fullness has to do with what we joyfully welcome and share. Such a great way to put that. But then he gets into hope, and I mean, but it's exactly like you say. By recognizing that God is our first and only hope, we too pass from fleeting hopes to a lasting hope. Once we desire that God accompany us on the journey of life, material wealth becomes relativized, for we discover the real treasure we need. And he sort of pays that even off more so in a very particular way. And this harkens to when we had John Wynn from the diocese on talking about the bishop's letter on Pilgrims of Hope about immigration. He goes, in a world darkened by war and injustice, even when all seems lost, migrants and refugees stand as messengers of hope. Their courage and tenacity bear heroic testimony to a faith that sees beyond what our eyes can see and gives them the strength to defy death on the various contemporary migration routes. So it's like you said, because he's an Augustinian, hope takes on multiple dimensions: eternal hope, hope in time, hope in the city of heaven, hope within the city of man, pointing to the city of God, and in real-world examples about what hope looks like in places that we often don't look for it.
With those last 2 quotes that you shared, the way that Pope Leo, but also like more of the recent popes that we've had, talk about things like material wealth or migrants, to me it's a challenge to all of us in this sense. Like when you say, what does the Pope think about a just economy? Mm-hmm. And our first impulse is to jump to policies or like debates that we're prone to have in our society. But listen to what he says there. Once we desire that God accompany us on the journey of life, material wealth becomes relativized, for we discover the real treasure that we need. And so, like, you know, you'll find commentators, like sometimes libertarians, who say like the Pope is a socialist. But I mean, that quote doesn't really push in that direction. Like, there's a different framework that he has in mind, or describing migrants and refugees and how they stand as messengers of hope. You know, it hasn't moved to any sort of like policy proposal. He's just asking us to see the world in a certain light. And in that sense, you know, it does remind me of oftentimes the way that Christ addressed certain questions. So when religious leaders, you know, kind of tried to trap him by saying, like, should we pay taxes to Caesar? He takes the coin, like, whose image is on this? And he sort of like, he turned the conversation upside down. Like, he pushed it in a different direction. And I think all of us could benefit from saying, like, how do we do that? Now, if I try to pull that off, sometimes I'll probably just sound like a clever dork or something, you know, like you don't want to be like too clever by half or whatever. But it is sort of like, it's not really, what I'm saying is, it's like, it's not trying to reach like a strategy or a solution. It's beginning to see the world sort of like through a divine lens.
I mean, I think that, like, I love how you put that, is like the refusing to allow the wordsmiths trying to trap him, the capability to pigeonhole him, and actually figuring out the best way to say something that would make everyone mad if they're not being charitable, but to those that have charity in their heart, to sort of let that work on their heart, to open up a different way to think about this situation. He more recently, so like we've been really like going heavy on the first 100. He very recently has had, I think this is September 11th, so this is very recent. He had new bishops in. And it's interesting, you want to talk about a way that you can see a priority of a pope is to see what he says to these bishops. And so, guess what he talks about, bud? Peace. So, okay, Pope, he says, a peace is a challenge for all. So I like how he puts this. Ready-made answers learned 25 years ago in seminary are not enough. A sick burn, but like not too mean, right? Being nice about it, but pointing out right. One must be persevering disciples, not frightened by the first difficulty. Pastors close to the people and to priests, merciful yet firm, even when judgment is required. Capable of listening and dialogue, not just giving sermons. Synodality, he added, is not a pastoral method, but a style of church of listening and of a common search for the mission to which we are called. Be builders of bridges, he urged them, able to enhance the role of the laity in the life of the church, promoting their integration, and serving a disarmed and disarming peace, because peace is a challenge for all. So, of course, some people are going to talk about the echoes with Pope Francis, obviously.
Yeah.
And I also think people oftentimes ignore how much those were echoes of both JP2 and Benedict XVI, much more than people realize. But his idea of bridge builder, and what that means, right? Like, tell me if I'm wrong. Isn't that like literally what pontifex means in Latin or something like this? Or it's like an etymology of this. We talk about like building bridges or being a bridge builder, and sometimes I think it becomes a matter of course. But I think when you talk about the real divisions of the church, and maybe that's something that we can like lightly point to and say, maybe that's been a problem just in sort of church leadership in general for a while, is it's easy to get caught up in a lot of these different sort of like which category do you belong to? Am I really in this group or not? And he really does want to say, how is it going to be that we build bridges across this these divisions, or otherwise we're not going to be that beacon of hope for people. So I think that's a good insight precisely into what he's saying to the bishops.
Well, I like in that quote that you shared where he talks about like not just repeating by rote like what you learned in seminary 25 years ago, or thinking like just giving a sermon is enough. He has this kind of like a very like humane way of addressing his confreres. And when we were going through the 50 quotes on Catholic News Agency, like you highlighted his ones regarding family life, but he also had some wonderful sort of like direct addresses to priests and even to altar servers. And I think in that way, Bo, like, with St. Therese, the little flower, we talk about her little way, that there are saints who stand out for doing the miraculous or practicing heroic virtue by perhaps like giving their life in some manner. Of course, like St. Joan of Arc stands out to me as someone like it's obvious why like children are drawn to stories of her life, right? But Pope Leo, like he comes back, I think, to this little way, and he reminds us that all of us have opportunities for holiness on a day-to-day basis. So the stable union of man and woman, like, will that be written about in the annals of history? Probably not, but it does require a sort of like consistency, like a commitment to the foundational vows that you made, et cetera, et cetera. With priests and bishops, I think the way like he kind of frames the things there, it's like, it's not like you have to jump to martyrdom. Like some of you in different parts of the world may be called to that, but he's sort of like, he puts real flesh on the bones in terms of the kinds of activities that they're involved in on a week-to-week basis.
I mean, I think maybe this is a great way to close this, is we talk about him talking about diplomats, talking to these big groups, but I actually think him talking to the altar servers was this sort of everything that we've been getting about in sort of like one small little way, like you were pointing out. So just some of the things he said to the altar servers. Dear altar servers, the celebration of the Mass saves us today. It saves the world today. It is the most important event in the life of the Christian and in the life of the Church, for it is the encounter where God gives himself to us in love, again and akin. Christians, added the Pope, do not attend Mass out of obligation, but out of love and our own need for the life of God. And then he goes on to say, may your attitude, your silence, the dignity of your service, the liturgical beauty, the order and majesty of your gestures lead the faithful into the sacred greatness of the mystery. And, I mean, that is just, again, like you point out, Benedict XVI gets called the liturgical pope, and understandably why. He wrote on this. But, I mean, as you said, like, the personal devotion, I don't know how to say it. Like, again, we don't want to try to, like, pit popes against each other and that there's different gifts that they bring. But the sort of simplicity of talking about how great the Mass is, that is just a catechism of the beauty of the Mass in a few words. And I just think the context of saying that to young altar servers makes that even more pregnant with meaning and depth that really ties together everything that we've said so far. I found that very moving myself. And again, I saw a video of it. Nearly everything he says is video. He's truly an internet pope at this point. Just even the video, the exuding of, like, he personally means this and he wants to pass this flame of desire for the Mass to these young people. It was just really great to see, bud.
Yeah.
I think that we're getting here at the end. A minute left. I just got to say that when we come to words like peace and hope, things that we all know, popes are supposed to say for Leo XIV, but I think we see in seed form already the multiple ways that they intertwine. And yes, Leo XIII and St. Augustine are good baselines for understanding this. But I think there's even more depth to it that I'm excited to see how this sort of grows and takes root as his papacy goes forward.
Yeah, we did a series a while back on servant leadership, and I think this episode for me has been a reminder that insofar as God calls us to be leaders, whether that's as parents, educators, public servants, whatever it happens to be, like the world is watching, those around us are watching, and so to model that love of Christ and that sort of like peaceable spirit, it's a gift that we can give to the world. Like sometimes it will be followed by preaching explicitly the truth of the gospel. But I'm grateful for this 130 days. Continue to pray for the Holy Father. He's got a tough assignment.
Yeah, and I mean, I another wonderful thing about him, on multiple occasions he said exactly that this is something we're in together, and if you pray for me, that's what he needs most from us. He has a lot of challenges ahead. We didn't really get into like the sort of like church politics of any of these things, but I feel very confident about the spirit of peace that he's bringing forward into these difficulties. And again, let's all make sure to pray for our Holy Father, Leo XIV. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr, joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. Imogene Ingredients makes it all possible, so if you want to thank them, you can go to iowacatholicradio.com on the business sponsor page, find them, and you can tell them thank you for making The Uncommon Good have a home here on Iowa Catholic Radio. Bud, as always, good show, good talking, and I think, we could have just probably read Leo XIV quotes for the entire hour and been in a good way, but it's always nice to sort of recollect about anything, but to sit and sort of recollect about a new pope here in his first 100-plus-ish days, actually very encouraging. I'm glad we got to do it.
Yeah, you mentioned that article that's available at Catholic News Agency. It's worth finding, I think, because it not only has like some key quotes, but it hyperlinks to the addresses that the Holy Father gave. So it's a great resource. You mentioned at the end of the second segment about Pope Leo's request that the faithful pray for him. If you want to do that and also join us in our prayer life here at Iowa Catholic Radio, you can do so. We broadcast the Rosary on air at 4:30 a.m., 10 a.m., 6 a.m., 10 a.m., and then 8:30 p.m. to close out your day. You can also pray the Chaplet of Divine Mercy at 2:57, or use the Iowa Catholic Radio app to pray the Rosary anytime, anywhere.
Wonderful. So, folks, we, of course, don't exist except by your prayers, by your donation of your time, and the donation of your treasure. The big one's coming up, the fall fundraiser. That starts September 30th. That's on Tuesday, and it's going to run through the rest of that week. Hearing Message of Hope. Hope with Frequency is the name of the game there, but you can start the donations and the pledges now, 515-223-1150 or iowacatholicradio.com to donate. Bud, great show. See you next week.
Yeah, blessings.
This is The Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, family, city, state, nation, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is The Uncommon Good. We'll be back next week.